Starting in 2027, new school buses purchased need to be zero-emission vehicles as districts prepare to comply with a state mandate that their entire fleet be electric by 2035. State policymakers have taken steps to provide some wiggle room with these deadlines, but the transition still remains a Herculean challenge with only a few hundred zero-emission buses on the road as of mid-2025. For more on the process and how to achieve it, we're joined on the Capitol Press Room by Adam Reuter, Director of Clean Transportation for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thanks for making the time, Adam.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So for starters, a report last fall from state education officials found that about 200 green buses were on the road at that time out of nearly 50,000 school buses in use. Has there been any incremental or maybe even exponential growth as we talk in May of 2026, or does the picture look pretty much the same in terms of what's on the road?
So, great question. The process for switching to zero-emission buses is going to be a long process. It's not happening overnight. First off, no school bus fleet flips their entire fleet all at once. It turns over a course of about 10 years. So, what we are seeing is that there are hundreds more school buses, about almost 1,000 more school buses that are on order from school districts and school bus fleets. And those are working their way through the procurement process. We expect them to be, delivered soon. And we do expect to see a big increase in the number of school buses on the road. But, this is a process. It happens over a number of years. We are also working with a lot of school districts right now, over 500 school districts right now, on either developing electrification plans or we've already completed their electrification plans to help inform the process and help them understand what steps to take and what the flow of a transition could look like.
But do you have a sense of how many have already been purchased and are on the road? Because, like you said, this is a long process, and if it is going to take a decade, and we have about 50,000 buses, if you were to do it incrementally, you'd want to see 5,000 old buses phased out with 5,000 new green buses every year at that rate. So are we at, for example, 5,000 yet, or are we still hoping to sort of ramp things up towards something like that?
No, we're still ramping up.
Okay. And it's my understanding that in addition to some of that logistical support you mentioned, NYSERDA is offering financial support for the purchase of electric school buses and help covering the cost of the charging infrastructure. With those programs, though, what sort of out-of-pocket costs are districts looking at for vehicles as well as the relevant infrastructure?
Yes, that's right. So with NYSERDA funding through our New York State School Bus Incentive Program, we are using $500 million of the Environmental Bond Act money that Governor Hochul put through in 2022 to support to bring down the cost of upfront cost of the school buses. So that can cover a significant portion of the cost of the buses, and especially when combined with state school transportation aid, that often covers the entire cost of the bus so that local taxpayers are not paying certainly any more than they'd be paying for a diesel bus, and often maybe even paying less than they'd be paying for a diesel bus. On the charging side, it's a similar story. NYSERDA incentives can cover up to 100% of the cost of the chargers. And we will cover more if you've completed a fleet electrification plan and show that you have a good understanding of what charging is needed and have done that some of those initial studies to understand how you're going to charge them and what speed charging is needed. Mm-hmm. And between utility programs and state education transportation aid, that often covers any remaining costs there.
Well, before we move on, let me reintroduce you. For listeners just joining us, I'm David Lombardo, and this is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're talking about the transition to zero-emission school buses with Adam Reuter, Director of Clean Transportation for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Can you help me explain sort of the numbers here? Because you talked about the $500 million commitment from Governor Hochul and said that's covering a significant cost. But again, if we're talking about 50,000 buses, multiply that by $10,000, that gets you to $500 million, and $10,000 is that's not even going to cover my Honda Accord, let alone an electric school bus. So how does that math work? I mean, I imagine we're going to need to spend tens of billions of dollars to replace the fleet. So where does all that money come from, and how can there be no out-of-pocket costs, or no out-of-pocket costs beyond what you might have traditionally paid for a diesel bus?
So our program covers the up to about, potentially up to about $250,000 of the cost of a bus.
Okay.
State Education Department transportation aid can also, is scaled based on the need of the school district. Can be up to 90%, as low as 6%, but up to most school districts are between 50 and 90% state aid. And there are special rules actually around this Bond Act money that allow for the Bond Act money to essentially cover any of the local share that's required, and transportation aid can cover what's remaining. So that's actually, it's a little bit different rules than with diesel buses. And so if a school district normally is getting 70% of their costs covered on a diesel bus, they're still on the hook for that last 30%. If you're getting money through the school bus incentive program, you may not actually have to cover that last 30%. You're right that the money allocated for this program is not going to cover the transition for 50,000 buses or 45,000 buses. But there is plenty of money available now for schools, and we encourage every school across the state to act now and to get some buses on the road, get them in the fleet, understand how they're working, use the money that has been allocated while it's available. I can't speak to whether more money will be allocated in the future, but we do expect that we are seeing battery prices coming down over time. We are seeing new battery innovations coming into the market, and when you look at what batteries cost 5 years ago or even 10 years ago and how they performed 5 or 10 years ago, there's really been major improvements, and we expect that to continue coming into the market and bring the price of buses down. We haven't seen the prices come down yet.
Haven't they increased actually?
We have heard some reports that some bus prices have increased, and that is because we've seen prices of all kinds of vehicles increase, whether it's tariffs, whether it's supply chain issues. There are a lot of reasons. It's not just about the battery prices, but we do expect the prices to come down over time. And we are seeing that we expect to see cost savings over time on the operations as well. So when you look at the whole picture, yes, the money that we have now is not going to cover 50,000 buses, but we think it's a great start and is going to help the schools in the early parts of this transition, which is the time when they're going to need the most help.
Well, let's talk about the power that the school buses will need as well, because there have been some districts that have said that they've had contact with their utility company, and the utility says they're simply not in a position to provide the district with the power that they will either need once all their vehicles are transitioned, or even if just some of them are transitioned to zero emission and requiring electricity. So what are you hearing from utilities, and what, if anything, can be done to build out that capacity as school districts embark on this transition?
So utilities are required to serve their electric customers, and they can and will, given enough forewarning, bring power to where it needs to go. The challenge is that a lot of school districts can electrify some buses now, but it is going to be a challenge when you've got 50, 100, some districts may even have 200 buses that all need to be electrified to do that with the current power availability. And that's why, as you said, it's important for schools to talk to their utilities early in the process. One of the things that we are doing is we are working to try to identify locations that are going to need utility upgrades sooner rather than later. And the Public Service Commission has actually started a process whereby they're looking to work with the utilities to identify some of these areas of need where we know we're going to need the electricity, but they may not need it tomorrow, but we know we're going to need it over the next 5 or 10 years, and start making those utility grid upgrades, electric grid upgrades now. Because the last thing we want is for schools to have to wait, if it's going to take a few years to do some of these upgrades, we don't want them to have to wait, and that be the holdup. There's another proceeding at the Public Service Commission around medium and heavy duty Make Ready program, which Make Ready is essentially all of the equipment and infrastructure up to the charging station. And there's currently a program and an offering for light duty vehicle charging, so passenger car charging, that can cover a pretty significant cost of the percentage of the costs of that equipment. And the commission is also considering whether to do something like that for medium and heavy duty vehicles as well. So that could cover school buses.
And after a quick break, we'll continue our conversation about the transition to zero-emission school buses in New York with Adam Reuter, Director of Clean Transportation for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And one note, a few hours after we recorded our conversation on Friday, Newsday reported that the state budget may end up including language that pushes back the deadline for finishing the transition to zero-emission school buses. Support for the Capitol Press Room comes from O'Donnell & Associates, a public affairs firm providing strategic guidance to businesses and nonprofits on navigating policy and regulatory issues. More information is available at o'donnellsolutions.com. This is WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, and we're continuing our conversation about the transition to zero-emission school buses with Adam Reuter, Director of Clean Transportation for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And one note, after we recorded this conversation on Friday, Newsday reported that the state budget may include language that delays the deadline for transitioning away from diesel-powered buses. Well, sticking with the idea of upgrades and infrastructure, one of the things that we've heard about is the idea of space for these buses, and that you're not maybe necessarily going to store them the same way you would have with diesel vehicles, and maybe they need to be further apart. Is that something that is a realistic concern for school districts? And if it is, how do they go about that type of transition if you can't just sort of plug a new school bus into that same spot where the old school bus might have gone?
It's a great question. There are some school districts, especially in urban areas, where there's not, the bus lot has buses parked very close together, and you may not have space to put a charger in where they can plug in. We are working with some partners that have proposed alternative setups, either wireless charging that can have a pad in the ground and you essentially just pull over it and it can charge the bus that way. We've worked on with some transit bus fleets. Actually, there's some transit bus fleets in New York State, out in Buffalo and elsewhere, that have done overhead charging as well, where the charger essentially can be dropped down from the ceiling to charge as well. So there are some solutions. There may be some situations where a bus fleet decides that they need to expand their parking area or their depot. And to the point of power availability, it may be the case that there are some districts that say, you know what, it's going to be less expensive or easier or quicker to use to build a new bus depot at a different location than their current one. And that may be an option for some districts as well.
If someone does decide, okay, looks like we're going to need a new depot, is there money for that type of upfront infrastructure investment, especially if it's something that's not going to be utilized right away because maybe they still want to use a more convenient or an existing facility for whatever reason.
NYSERDA does not have funds for building new depots. I believe that there is state education money for new depots, but I'm not an expert on that.
And as you talked about with, say, an urban center and the needs they have, or certain parts of the state and the power they might have access to, I think that speaks to the unique challenges that face various school districts. And to that end, we've heard the case made that people would like to see NYSERDA come up with individual transition plans for school districts, as opposed to the way the current law is laid out with, while there's waivers for that initial 2027 deadline, you still all need to have the transition done by 2035. From a practical perspective, though, is that even something that's feasible? NYSERDA coming up with 700 plus transition plans that take into account everybody's different needs and capacity?
So I mentioned earlier that we're working with over 500 school districts already to develop the fleet electrification plans. And
are they that different, though?
Yeah.
Okay.
Each one is individualized. Each one, the school bus fleet pairs up with an engineering firm to look at their unique logistics, their routes that they drive, their depot, and understand their electric rates depending on what utility they're in, and really come up with an individualized plan. So that is what is coming out of all of those plans, and we're eager to work with every district in the state.
And as you have those relationships, what are some of the things you're hearing, and what sort of concerns have you had to quell? And do you feel like any of them are misplaced, for example? I mean, do you feel like you have to fight myths or misperceptions in this process?
So I think there are definitely a lot of myths going around. And one of the big things that we hear a lot about is the range of the buses. And concerns about cold weather. Those are very common questions that have been raised by mostly school districts that are thinking about buying buses or have concerns about switching to electric. And one of the things that we've really tried to hone in on is talking to some of the districts that have buses, because there are now dozens of districts that are operating buses and have been operating them through this cold winter that we just went through, and really, all year for a few years now. And there was even legislation passed a year or two ago directing the bus manufacturers to do better published range estimates of their buses under different conditions. And one of the things that we've heard is that from the bus operators that have electric buses, generally they've been saying that, the estimates that our bus dealer and the OEM gave us were pretty accurate. They're not trying to sugarcoat it. They don't want you to have high expectation and then underperform. They are trying to give you good information. And what they've said is that, they put a lot of thought into this before they got the buses, talked to people, and tried to understand what to expect, and that their expectations were met. And so that to me is very encouraging, that a lot of the concerns about the range estimates not being accurate or being overstated are from folks who haven't actually been operating the buses. And the folks who have been operating the buses seem to be pretty pleased with what they're seeing, including with cold weather performance. They're getting what they expected.
One of the challenges that was brought up about the implementation of these buses was this idea, as you pointed out, about cold temperatures. Another thing was brought up was hilly terrain, with the Central New York lawmakers saying that those are real common environmental challenges for them, although I don't know whether Central New York is actually more hilly than other parts of the state. But they said there is a decrease in mileage between 20 to 50%. When you hear something like that, does that ring true to you, or does that seem like one-off accounting? Does that sound like fear-mongering? I mean, how do you take into consideration those real concerns versus things that might be overblown?
There is definitely a loss of range in cold weather. And, we see 35% is a reasonable estimate of that. But I think it's important to note that that's baked into these electrification plans. They're not just looking at what this is going to be like on a 70-degree sunny spring day. They're looking at what it's going to be like on a cold day, because we know we live in upstate New York. It's going to be cold and it's going to be snowy, and that's what we need to plan for. So while, yes, there is a loss of range in the winter because you need to heat the cabin of the bus and you want the kids to be warm. Number one, there are things you can do about it to minimize that, like preheating the buses before they leave for their route while they're still plugged in, or putting on auxiliary heaters on the buses so you're not draining the battery to heat the cabin of the bus. We've seen both of those solutions work quite well. But also, I think what we're seeing is that the buses are performing as expected, and that means that not every bus route and not every use case is going to be electrifiable today. But what we've seen overwhelmingly from these plans and from real world experience is that every school district, or at least virtually every school district, has some routes that work with the technology today. We're seeing somewhere north of 70% of all the bus routes that have been analyzed are capable of running electric buses today. So yes, there can be a loss there will be a loss of range in the winter, but it's not insurmountable, and with the proper planning, that can still work with most fleets.
Well, we've been speaking with Adam Reuter. He's the Director of Clean Transportation for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Adam, thank you so much for making the time, and good luck on this process.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided by New York State United Teachers, a statewide union of nearly 700,000 professionals in education and healthcare.